In the spring of 1554, Elizabeth Tudor was in grave danger. Her half-sister, Queen Mary, had imprisoned her in the Tower of London on suspicion of being involved in the Wyatt Rebellion. The insurrection was against the Queen's plan to marry the Spanish Crown Prince Philip, who was a staunch Catholic. Elizabeth was forced to live in the same chambers where her mother Anne Boleyn had been held before her execution 18 years earlier. According to Tracy Borman, the Queen's advisors had already written up Elizabeth's death warrant. All Mary had to do was sign it. As she held the ink-soaked quill that could end her half-sister's life, her hand hovered over the document. However, she ultimately chose not to sign it. On May 19, 1554, Elizabeth was released from the tower and placed under house arrest in the old royal hunting mansion at Woodstock. Until then, Elizabeth did not know whether she was to be allowed to live or had to face execution. It wasn't until the anniversary of her mother's execution that her fate was revealed to her. During her time at the tower, Elizabeth learned two valuable lessons that would shape the rest of her life. She should never be replaceable, and she should avoid making decisions until they are unavoidable. These principles guided her forever. Elizabeth had very few people in Mary's government who were on her side. Only William Baron Paget advocated for Anne Boleyn's daughter. On the other hand, Elizabeth had many enemies. Lord Chancellor Bishop Stephen Gardiner, Mary's cousin Emperor Charles V, and the Imperial Ambassador Simon Renard all believed that Elizabeth's execution was necessary to ensure the Queen's permanent hold on the throne. There were even rumors that Margaret Douglas, Mary's best friend and potential heir, had spoken in favor of Elizabeth's execution. However, there was a lack of evidence to support such a decision. The government tried everything to find evidence, or at least to fabricate it. The insurgent leader Thomas Wyatt was at the center of these efforts. He had already been sentenced to death before Elizabeth arrived at the tower. However, the execution had been postponed. Wyatt, who had initially supported Mary even against Lady Jane Grey at the beginning of her reign, was now being pushed to incriminate Elizabeth as much as possible. As a side note, it wasn't Wyatt's first time being involuntarily held at the tower. During the reign of Edward VI, he had also been imprisoned here for a few days because he had drunkenly smashed windows. Wyatt, however, refused to name Elizabeth as the head of the rebellion, only stating that she may have known about the plan. His co-conspirator, Sir James Croft, could say more. Wyatt instead heavily incriminated his other co-conspirator, Edward Courtenay. He was the real head of the conspiracy. Mary's interrogators capitulated. April 11th, 1554 was designated as the day of Wyatt's execution. As a resident of the tower whose name is unknown to us reports in a private chronicle, there were two peculiarities. First, Wyatt asked to be allowed to speak with Courtenay, who had been imprisoned in the tower since February 12th. Second, his last words were to be interrupted. Wyatt's request was granted. According to the source, he had to be carried to Courtenay, who was imprisoned in the tower above Traitor's Gate. This shows the massive torture he was most likely subjected to. The two men talked for about half an hour. Unfortunately, the exact content of the conversation has not been handed down. However, Wyatt's last words give an idea of what was said. He not only withdrew his accusations against Elizabeth, but also exonerated Courtenay. In doing so, he probably saved two lives. Henry Weston, who oversaw the execution of Wyatt, interrupted the condemned man, which was highly unusual. According to the Tower resident, he spoke this sentence, which I will modernize for you. Note this, my lords, he said that which he had showed to the council in writing of my Lady Elizabeth and Courtenay is true. In this way, he confirmed that Wyatt had not lied to protect his reputation in the public eye, which held Elizabeth in high esteem but secretly incriminated her. It's unclear how Mary's advisors responded. It was a remarkable parallel of history. Wyatt's father had been imprisoned in the wake of the allegations against Anne Boleyn on suspicion of having had an affair with the Queen. The only thing that saved him was his friendship with Thomas Cromwell. Weston's father Francis was less fortunate. He was beheaded on May 17, 1536. Now the sons of the two men faced each other, and Weston had to supervise the execution on behalf of the Queen. Mary herself dealt with the fact that Wyatt had exonerated her half-sister in a surprising way. She confiscated Wyatt's estates because he was a convicted traitor. However, she provided his family with a small pension that allowed them to survive. Among Wyatt's descendants was Wallace Simpson, for whom King Edward VIII abdicated his throne. Wyatt himself was beheaded before being quartered. He thus escaped the worst part of his punishment. Courtenay, who had betrayed the rebellion before it even started, was released from the Tower and exiled to Venice. Mary's government tried for 4 more weeks to find any incriminating material against the Queen's half-sister, but to no avail. The public grew increasingly resentful of the continued imprisonment of the heir to the throne, especially after Wyatt, who had been visibly tortured, cleared her name. Additionally, Mary's judges informed her that her half-sister could not be found guilty under the current laws. It is not clear what ultimately led to Elizabeth's release from the Tower and her house arrest in Oxfordshire. While some argue that it was due to the Queen's conscience, which emerged just in time, others point out that between 1554 and 1555, people from Elizabeth's household were repeatedly arrested on suspicion of treason. This suggests that the Queen continued to view her half-sister as a threat. Modern historians have described the Queen as paranoid about Elizabeth. Another thesis uses the popularity of Anne Boleyn's daughter as an argument for why Mary spared Elizabeth's life. Even this justification is not entirely convincing. During the Wyatt Rebellion, 20,000 people in London had volunteered to fight for the Queen. She had just successfully crushed the uprising. It had not found the popular support that its leaders had hoped for. Elizabeth was likely allowed to live for several reasons. The Queen saw the rebellion as an attack by Protestants on the true religion, who were allegedly equipped with, quote, a Spanish cloak to cover their pretended purpose, as she wrote in a letter. Mary couldn't imagine that Catholics could also be against her marriage to the heir to the Habsburg throne. The rise of English nationalism was not a relevant force in her eyes. Elizabeth had never made any public comments regarding Mary's plans to get married, even though she appeared to be a Catholic attending Mass twice a day. She avoided speaking in support of the Catholic faith. She would often cough or clear her throat to excuse herself from speaking at sensitive points during Mass. Mary had been aware that her half-sister was only pretending to be a Catholic since December 1553. In fact, at that time Mary had even accused Elizabeth of it. Despite this, Anne Boleyn's daughter was still valuable to Mary as a symbol. The more Elizabeth was seen attending Mass, the less suitable she was as a leader of Protestantism. However, if Mary were to have her half-sister executed, Elizabeth would become a martyr. And therefore, it was more beneficial for Mary to keep Elizabeth alive and permanently convert her to Catholicism. On top of that, her wedding to Philip was getting closer and closer. The wedding ceremony had already encountered major issues and difficulties. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, was imprisoned for being a heretic. Typically, he would have been the one to conduct the wedding ceremony and crown Philip as the king. However, if Elizabeth remained imprisoned in the Tower during the wedding, it was cast a dark shadow over the ceremony. Elizabeth was still the heir to the throne. Her execution around the time of the wedding would have been disastrous. To avoid any potential issues, Elizabeth had to disappear from the public eye. If she wanted to play an active role, she would have to comply with the Queen's demands. This impression is evident in the sources available. Officially, Mary was done with her half-sister, and Elizabeth's name does not appear in the collection of Mary's state papers for the rest of the Queen's life. In this situation, Mary was a perfect blend of her parents, possessing Catherine's political acumen and Henry's stubbornness. Mary initially felt vindicated in her decision to keep Elizabeth under house arrest, as it seemed to work in her favor. While over 200 rebel leaders were executed, most ordinary prisoners were pardoned for a fine. This prevented any serious uprisings against Mary for the rest of her reign. In addition to the emotional significance, Mary's marriage to Philip was also economically beneficial for England. Philip brought 20 cartloads of American silver to the wedding, which helped to support the weak English economy. The Royal Mint was allowed to mint silver coins for Spain, which marked its first foreign order. Mary proved herself to be a capable ruler in economic matters. During her reign as Queen of England, Mary made significant strides in modernizing the country, which her predecessors had failed to do. England still adhered to the rules of the late medieval economic system, despite its collapse in the second half of the 15th century. Mary caught up on the overdue reforms, which would benefit her successor for decades to come. In September 1554, Mary received good news as she gained weight and her menstruation stopped, leading her physicians and court attendants to believe that she was pregnant. The Queen herself also experienced nausea, which further convinced everyone of her pregnancy. The imperial ambassador even reported back home that there was no doubt that the Queen was carrying a child. Mary felt empowered and began to take violent action against the Protestants in her kingdom. Just a month after announcing her miraculous pregnancy, she had Bishops Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer burned. Thomas Cranmer, whom she hated, was in prison awaiting his indictment as a heretic. According to Mary's wishes, Cardinal Reginald Pole was to play a decisive role in this. Her close confidant returned on November 23, 1554 from his exile and assumed the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. Mary's great goal now was for her child to be born in an England where the Pope would be the head of the Church again. Parliament supported Mary on this issue. In January 1555, the Second Act of Repeal was passed, which made England a Catholic kingdom again. The law also removed the legal hurdle to prosecute Protestants more severely. Corresponding actions began as early as February 1555. The unpopular burnings earned the Queen the nickname Bloody Mary. Nearly 300 of her subjects were to die at the stake. However, historians have debated whether her reputation for cruelty is accurate. The Book of Martyrs by John Fawkes, published in 1563, was instrumental in creating the image of Bloody Mary. As a Protestant, Fawkes had a strong religious interest in portraying Mary as a monstrous and frightening figure. Mary viewed the use of burnings as a necessary means to deter Protestants from their faith and was surprised by the number of Protestants who chose death by fire over converting to Catholicism. However, she believed that the most important aspect of her efforts was ensuring that no new Protestant clerics could emerge, hence she strictly monitored seminaries and universities. During Elizabeth's time of house arrest, she was under the guard of Sir John Williams, who treated her kindly. It is assumed that Elizabeth acted with extreme caution during this time so as not to upset her half-sister. As the announcement of Mary's pregnancy meant that Elizabeth would lose her position in the line of succession, she had to be careful not to do anything that could jeopardize her safety. During the spring of 1555, Mary found herself in a situation similar to her mother's towards the end of Catherine's and Henry's marriage. Mary had a responsibility to produce an heir, as failure to do so would put her position and Catholicism in England at risk. At the time, Mary was fully aware of potential consequences if Elizabeth was to come to power. However, it is unclear whether or not the Queen recognized the parallel between her mother's life and her own, or if Mary was trying to break the curse that had plagued her since Anne entered her life. Regardless, Mary followed the customary practice of withdrawing to Hampton Court in the spring of the year for the birth of her child. She ordered Elizabeth to be present when her heir to the throne entered the world. If you want to, you can interpret this order as a gesture of reconciliation between siblings, which must have taken place in 1555, at least on the surface. However, I find it difficult to consider it as anything other than an attempt to humiliate Elizabeth. The Queen, for instance, stated that the Spanish King Philip should be regent for the child, not her half-sister, should she die during childbirth. As we all know, events took a different turn. The calculated due date came and went, and it was not until July that the Queen resigned amid mocking laughter from the political public. Her abdominal swelling had subsided. The Venetian ambassador Giovanni Michieli had recently predicted that the pregnancy would end, quote, in wind. Philip, much to the Queen's sadness, returned to the mainland just a month later. Most people saw the false pregnancy and Philip's departure as a sign that the Queen would never be able to have children. Mary was likely struggling with depression during that time. She believed that the events that occurred were God's punishment for tolerating heretics in her kingdom. As a result, she took even harsher action against them. One of her most prominent victims was Cranmer, who had renounced Protestantism for fear of being burned at the stake and turned back to Catholicism. Although it was customary for him to be pardoned, Mary did not follow this tradition. Cranmer was forced to read out his retraction in public shortly before his burning in October 1556. According to reports of the execution, he first put the hand into the fire with which he had signed the document by which he turned away from Protestantism. Historians agree that it was primarily an act of personal vengeance on the part of the Queen, as Cranmer had annulled her parents' marriage. Elizabeth might even have become a threat to Mary's marriage, at least in the eyes of the monarch. Despite Philip's constant search for new mistresses on the continent, there is little doubt that the Queen was truly in love with them. For example, Michieli reported she was, quote, extraordinarily in love. Philip, however, had already discovered while he was still in England that Elizabeth was, let's say, of marriageable age. According to Michieli, the Habsburg prince had considered marrying Mary's half-sister in case the Queen died giving birth. However, there is some disagreement about how serious these considerations were. In a letter to his brother-in-law Maximilian, Philip expressed doubts about whether Mary was pregnant. Following the false pregnancy, Philip aimed to establish a positive relationship with Elizabeth, most likely having already supported her while she was under house arrest. Mary's half-sister was pleased to accept the king's friendships. As per J. E. Neely, she made every effort to integrate herself into Philip's circle of Spanish friends at court. In October 1555, Elizabeth was permitted to leave Mary's court and return to her household, but it's uncertain whether it was a sign of Queen Mary's confidence in her half-sister. It's more likely that Mary couldn't tolerate Elizabeth's presence anymore. At this point, Mary began focusing on a topic she had never been thrilled about: finding a suitable husband for Elizabeth. Philip advocated for Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy, and with good reason. Not only would he ensure a Catholic succession, but he was also Philip's trusted proxy in England. After Mary's death, Philibert would be a suitable puppet. In December 1553, Elizabeth had also agreed to have her name linked with Philibert's. This option was more favorable than making Mary, Queen of Scots, the heir, even so she was Catholic. Mary, the later Queen of Scots, promised to the French Dauphin, was too close to the Habsburgs' greatest enemies. Elizabeth, however, knew that time was on her side. She was safe as heir to the throne after the disaster of the false pregnancy. Even for the Spaniards, she was considered a better alternative than her Scottish great cousin. She refused all marriage requests. Philip's 4-month visit to England, beginning in March 1557, was primarily intended to persuade Elizabeth to change her mind. Mary must have been hurt significantly, as she had been begging her husband to come back for a long time. It seems improbable that Parliament would have approved of such a marriage. Consequently, it gradually distanced itself from Mary. In December 1555, the Queen attempted to seize the assets of 100 Protestants in exile, but Parliament denied her request. Later, Philip reconsidered the idea of marrying Elizabeth himself. After she ascended the throne, he proposed a corresponding match, but the new English monarch had nothing of it and declined the offer. Philip became King of Spain in 1556. Mary, as his wife, thus became Queen of Spain. The Habsburg, now finally in power, wanted to eliminate Protestantism by all means. War was included. And war was what happened, but against Catholic France. France had done Philip the great favor of attacking the Spaniards. Mary rushed to her husband's aid and joined the war. Together they inflicted a heavy defeat on the French at the Battle of St. Quentin in August 1557, but the fortunes of the war turned against the English. Calais, the last English mainland base, was lost in January 1558. Mary is said to have reacted to this message with the following sentence: "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais engraved on my heart." Pope Paul IV raged over the war. He needed the French to defend him against the Habsburgs in northern Italy. England's participation had ensured that he could hardly expect any significant support. He therefore demanded the return of Paul to Rome in order to appoint a new Archbishop of Canterbury himself, who would bring the Queen to heel. Mary refused, going against the authority on which she had hitherto guided all her actions. Later on, this turned out to be helpful, albeit in a cynical way, for Elizabeth. The Pope had spoken out against Anne Boleyn's daughter inheriting Mary's throne. However, the relationship with the English Catholics had become so strained that this was no longer relevant. It was clear that the future of England lay in Elizabeth, and with that it was expected that Protestantism would return. Mary still hoped to prevent this from happening. She believed she was pregnant again in 1557. However, this time there were no preparations for her birth, apart from the fact that she made her will in the spring of 1558. It is tragic to read this from today's perspective. Convince yourself. To summarize, Mary believed she was pregnant and in good health, and even suggested once more her husband to be named as regent for the child. This was unrealistic as England had suffered significant losses in the war, while Habsburg had not. The Spanish king was more unpopular than ever. From 1555 to 1558, Mary's kingdom struggled with severe crop failures, leading to hunger and a severe influenza epidemic in 1558. One of Mary's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Dormer, fell ill but later recovered. The Queen herself may also have fallen sick. When Mary returned to London at the end of August 1558, after her false pregnancy, she asked Dormer how she was doing. Dormer replied with "reasonably well," to which Mary said, "So am not I." She then retired to her chambers and never left them again. Mary's health was deteriorating day by day, and she was having fever dreams frequently. According to Dormer's reports, she would sometimes wake up and recount seeing small children playing like angels beside her. The Queen used these stories to console her close ones by reminding them that whatever happens, God had allowed it. However, Mary's will posed a problem, as it did not name any heir except a child that was not born. This made her last will not only impractical, but also went against the current law of succession. To resolve this, Mary agreed to add a new passage to her will on October 28, 1558. Elizabeth is only confirmed by the insertion by the laws and statutes of this Rome. However, that was still not enough, as Elizabeth was not officially named despite actively preparing for her reign that very same month. Due to this reason, Mary was pushed further. The Queen finally sent Dormer to her half-sister with 3 conditions which she had to meet in order to be allowed to succeed Mary. First, it is important for England to remain Catholic. Second, Queen Elizabeth should treat Mary's servants well. Third, Queen Elizabeth is responsible for paying the crown's outstanding debts. It is said that Dormer demanded proof on Mary's behalf that Elizabeth was indeed a Catholic. Elizabeth reacted angrily to this, arguing that she had complied with this often enough. However, she accepted the terms. It is mentioned in the literature that Mary also acknowledged Elizabeth as her heiress by name on November 6, 1558, but I couldn't find a source for this. Mary passed away between 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning on November 17, 1558. Her good friend, Reginald Pole, survived her by just 12 hours. The diplomat Nicholas Throckmorton was tasked with informing Elizabeth of Mary's death. 6 hours after Mary's death, Throckmorton proclaimed Elizabeth as the new queen. It was then that the coronation ring was brought to Elizabeth, which was extensively checked for authenticity by her ladies-in-waiting. Mary's funeral was held on December 13, 1558, and her husband was not present. In a letter to his sister Joan, Philip expressed, quote, reasonable regret over her death. However, there was a scandal during the funeral when Winchester's Bishop John White gave an obituary for Mary and expressed doubts about Elizabeth's abilities as queen. As a result, Elizabeth had him arrested a day later. With Mary's death and Elizabeth's ascension to the throne, England's generational traumas of Catherine and Anne finally came to an end. Although there were others to follow, such as the great plot to assassinate Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, but we will not delve into them today. And as usual, thanks for watching, please like and subscribe.